My name is Jody Kilbasa. I'm the Vice Provost for the Arts and the Director of the Virginia Film Festival. And I'd like to welcome all of you to our very first episode of Beyond the Screen, a virtual conversation series. Now, today I'd like to welcome our special guest, Luke Lorentzen, who's a director, producer, cinematographer, and editor, and a graduate of Stanford University's Department of Art and Art History. His most recent film, Midnight Family, tells the story of a family-run ambulance business in Mexico City. The film has won over 35 awards from some of the world's most prestigious film festivals and organizations, including a special jury award for cinematography at the 2019 Sundance Film Festival. Midnight Family was also screened at last fall's Virginia Film Festival. Today's moderator is Federico Cuatlacuatl, a Virginia Film Festival guest programmer and University of Virginia Assistant Professor of Studio Art. Born in Cholula, Pueblo, Mexico, Federico is an indigenous artist based in Charlottesville, Virginia. He received his MFA specializing in digital arts from the Bowling Green State University in 2015. Federico's work is invested in disseminating topics of Latinx immigration, social art practice, and cultural sustainability. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us today. And Federico, I'll hand it off to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. Thank you for that nice introduction. Luke, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me.
How are things going for you?
Things are good. You know, it's hard to complain. I have a nice roof on my head, food on the table, and just taking the time to develop projects and try to kind of set things up so that when the world hopefully reopens, there's things to work on. But yeah, how about yourself?
I'm doing good. Things are good. I think we're all sort of learning new ways to cope and stay as productive, whatever that means, right, for every single one of us. But I was in the West Coast in early March. I was in Santa Cruz, and you're in the Bay Area, yeah, San Francisco.
Yeah.
And that, you know, the first cases were also in California, and being there and traveling back to the East Coast felt almost like escaping the West Coast because it was getting more tense there. But how are things in the Bay Area?
You know, they're better than they are on the East Coast. I think, you know, SF was the first city in the country to lock down. I think there's a lot of health officials still around from the AIDS epidemic, and they were kind of quick to take this sort of health risks seriously. And, you know, we've extended our lockdown until June 1st at the earliest. So, you know, we'll see. They seem to be taking it very seriously, which I appreciate.
Yeah, good. Yeah. Well, thank you for taking your time to be with us. We're super excited to launch these webinars for the Virginia Film Festival. I was super excited to see your film last film festival edition. So I have lots of questions, and hopefully we can formulate more of a conversation that goes into tangents and things that you're also excited to talk about, right? But maybe we can start out with sort of talking about currently how are you staying productive? How are you coping with being a filmmaker under this pandemic? You know, what has been on pause and what can still sort of keep going, right?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think the film industry is hit by this about as hard as any industry. You know, all the major studios have halted production, so anybody who works or makes a living on set is not working right now. Distribution, I mean, the idea of movie theaters, which were already on such thin ice, coming out of this healthy is going to be tricky. You know, I think the way that I've been thinking about the crisis in general is like anyone who was struggling before is going to have a really hard time coming out of it healthy. And documentary filmmakers, you know, it's an unpredictable business. Most of us aren't doing it for the money, and it's, it's impacting my colleagues in really different ways. Some people just finished a big shoot and they're in quarantine with terabytes of footage and they're making their next film, and others were just about to start shooting, internationally on multiple continents, and that's not going to happen for a while. I have a project that I'm, I need to be in South Africa for, and who knows when that's going to happen. And one of the solutions that I've kind of come up with is just to look more locally. So I've actually started developing a film just here in San Francisco, a story that's a few blocks from my house, which has been really important, I think, to kind of add those restrictions to the creative process and just kind of think about a simpler, easier film that has more to do with the place that I live in. So I think what's tough about it for all of us is how unpredictable it is, and the information we're getting is about as wide ranging as possible, and it's hard to plan, and it's hard to know what you can do each day that feels productive when these larger questions are so unanswered.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to, how do we develop new ways of staying productive, or at least feeling creative, at the very least now. It might be too early, but it seems like these situations also trigger for creativity and imagination to really sort of be pushed. And I wonder if you're anticipating ways that you can alternatively continue to produce or create ideas. Have you gotten that far, or are you still in this sort of anxious moment?
No, I definitely have gotten that far. I think I'm trying to put my eggs in a lot of different baskets. So different ideas, different projects that can kind of happen at different paces. So the simplest version of that is just writing. I'm working on, in a very casual way, a screenplay, which is not something I made time for before the lockdown. I was really in the thick of documentary work, and the time to learn something new wasn't there. And now I'm doing that and kind of discovering this whole other type of filmmaking that I think I'm more interested in than I gave myself credit for. And it's I get so much of my inspiration from people. I'm like a avid people watcher, and I miss that. I miss kind of the ability to go walk through the city or travel and just kind of have these stories and faces and feelings come to me. And trying to find alternate ways to do that online is tricky. It's not impossible. I've been doing a lot of kind of Zoom conversations and trying to set up ways to have kind of recurring meetings with people. The real world, you can go visit someone regularly without it being kind of so scheduled, but online it feels like it needs to be kind of rigidly put in place. But the longer that this goes on, I think the more comfortable we'll become with it. And I'm already starting to feel that of just kind of getting into a routine of this being a new normal for at least the foreseeable future.
Yeah, it seems like it'll be all artists and filmmakers sort of developing this comfort level with these situations, right? But it is ironic how this physical distance in a way has us closer together. Like I see a lot more of these kinds of sessions. You mentioned doing these kinds of interviews for other film festivals. Mm-hmm. And I have seen a lot more programming go online. So in a way, there seems to be more of this digital solidarity, but we're still seeking that contact, right? That person-to-person sort of mode of production as well. So that'll be interesting to see how your work sort of unfolds in the next few months.
We'll see. I think the other thing that I kind of wanted to say is just the role of film festivals in all of this. Like, I really appreciate you all doing this talk and trying to find ways to really get the voices of independent filmmakers out into the world. When you finish an independent film, you rely on a film festival circuit to build hype and get it out into the world. And without that, the playing field is really uneven. And I think, there are a lot of independent filmmakers out there with a great film really struggling to crack through.
Yeah.
They don't, if you haven't landed on kind of the big 3 or 4 streaming platforms, you need to climb this much longer ladder of festivals to theaters to reviews to eventually getting there. And that gap is kind of scary for me to see. And there's going to be a big backlog of really great films that struggle to get out into the world. Unless we do kind of events like this.
Yeah. So you are saying that these situations are going to put emerging filmmakers at a disadvantage to put their works out?
100%. I mean, there was already a gap of haves and have-nots created by this revolution of kind of streaming. If your film is picked up by Netflix, Amazon, Apple, Hulu, you are in a different stratosphere than if your film is picked up by kind of one of the traditional theatrical distributors that historically has been, a very healthy way to kind of get independent cinema out into the world. And the small deals have been getting smaller and smaller, and the big deals have been getting much fewer, but much bigger. And I think that this crisis might kind of even extend that gap more. But yeah, we'll see. It's so unpredictable, how this is going to affect all of these trends that were kind of already in place. It might upset them and change them, or it might exasperate them. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure some of the viewers will have more questions regarding that later on. But
I'm no kind of professional on this. I'm just kind of riffing on what my experience has in knowing that with Midnight Family, that film got out into the world because of a really robust festival run that eventually got it on HBO and on Netflix, in other parts of the world. But those deals were not available to us when the film was done. We needed, the hype of independent cinema lovers to get us there.
Yeah, it's almost like the invisible labor that is not often mentioned, right? Once you do the entire pre-production, then production, post-production, then
man. Yeah, the premiere of your film, some people say it's the midpoint. Like, making the film is half of it, and the other half is getting people to see it. And it is not an easy process, and it kind of asked a really different set of skills from me and the people that I was working with, of kind of how do we break through with this film.
Yeah. Well, I mean, congratulations again. I think you guys did a really great job on that part of the process, right? And a lot of the fruition is definitely visible. Seems like the film has reached quite a global audience, and you've gotten on some really nice platforms to be able to share the Ochoa's narrative, which I find intriguing, fascinating. Maybe before we move on to talking about the film, you can share with us sort of broadly how is it that you got into filmmaking? What sorts of influences? I know you're originally from the East Coast, Connecticut.
Yep.
Maybe we can backtrack that far and sort of start from there, or whatever you want to share in terms of getting into filmmaking.
Yeah, I started filmmaking when I was really little. I was a big skateboarder, and through skateboarding started filming my friends and just was playing with cameras kind of all the time. On weekends we would go out and skate and film ourselves, and that kind of evolved into wanting to tell more complicated stories. Always coming from real life, I think I felt the barrier to entry with fiction films was way higher. I needed a screenplay, I needed actors, I needed a crew, and with documentary, I felt like with a camera, I could go make a really great film. 2, if not 3 of the Oscar-nominated docs this year are shot on cameras that cost less than a few $100s. One of which on a not even an iPhone, like a cheaper smartphone. And that sort of energy was really inspiring to me, of like just knowing that as a one-person crew, you could make a really great film. So my first documentaries were just about people that lived on the street that I grew up on, people that I ran into on campus in college, and they just started to get longer and more complicated. And I made a film after my sophomore year of college in Colombia. It was a project that I kind of luckily raised money for on Kickstarter, not on a whim, but I didn't know what was going to happen, and I kind of put this campaign up and raised enough money to travel there for a summer and come back with footage to make a film about this island that has 1,200 people living on 2.5 acres. It's one of the most densely populated places in the world. And that process was kind of, drinking from a fire hose of putting myself on this island for 2 months with the camera and kind of telling myself I wasn't going to go home until I had footage for a film. And I edited it together, and it kind of proved to me that this was something I could maybe try and do professionally. So I finished college. I studied art history with a focus in film studies, and also studied some kind of more American studies, so more just general history, and moved to Mexico City a few weeks after I graduated. And that's when the whole Midnight Family journey kind of began.
So what happened there? What triggered for you to move to Mexico City?
One of my closest friends in college grew up in Mexico City, and we were living together for about 3 years as undergrads, and he was moving back home and kind of convinced me to come with him. I didn't know how long I was going to stay, but I went, and in that kind of first period of visiting him and his family, I met the Ochoa family just parked in front of the apartment that we were staying in. It's kind of a hard story to tell because it sounds just totally spontaneous and random, but I think it's part of a larger mindset of just like wanting to be in a space where I'm actively looking and finding stories that come from the strangest places. Knowing that if I kind of dig deeper into these small curiosities that are kind of tossed at me as I walk through a city, that things can kind of happen. And that's how Midnight Family really began. I started talking with them just in front of this apartment, and they were quick to invite me on a night of work. And in that first night, I just saw this whole range of feelings and ethical dilemmas, and decided to stay in Mexico. And that started kind of a 3-year process of filming on and off with them.
Yeah, maybe that'll be a nice segue to talk about sort of more extensively that beginning process, how this all unfolded. I'm sure there was a lot of relationship building with the Ochoa family, and I'm sure there were a lot of difficulties and challenges to propel this into motion, though.
Yeah, I mean, there were so many challenges. I think the thing that just looking back, one of the big takeaways is, my job as a director, more than the cinematography or even the storytelling, was just the relationship building with this family. And I knew that if I could kind of really win them over and prove to them that I was trustworthy, that was kind of my entry point to the story. And that took 3 years. 80% of what you see in the film came from the last 2 to 3 weeks of filming with them, despite having spent dozens and dozens of nights together. And those earlier nights were really just the process of getting to know each other. And it's a tricky story in that it is about ethical dilemmas. It's, I needed to be able to show the darkest, most flawed parts of the Ochoa's business in order for the story to be, a full telling of how that system works. And getting into those elements was tricky, and also a really big leap of faith that wasn't going to come with just kind of a week of filming.
Yeah, and I'm also curious about culturally navigating such a dense city. I would imagine this was not your first time in Mexico City, but it was maybe your first time spending a longer time there. And
exactly.
Spanish skills. What sorts of how were you navigating? First of all, being in Mexico City, but second of all, also in the Ochoa sort of daily routine seems like a lot of. It seems like a lot to take in.
So I spoke Spanish fluently before I went, which was a big help and kind of a necessity. I didn't speak Mexico City Spanish, which is very much its own beast, and something that I needed to kind of learn. But I think I again, going back to this relationship building, I knew that my journey to telling this story properly was going to be through the Ochoa family, and that they were going to be my guides. They were going to be the ones that really showed me how the system worked, but also how Mexico City works for them. And so I think, we were juggling a lot of questions about, whose story is this to tell? What is it what are the challenges that come with being a foreigner going to Mexico and coming, trying to make a film? And again, I think that's why it took us so long, is that we had a lot of learning to do. And that's not just with the Ochoa family, but also with the kind of filmmaking community in Mexico, and the film watching community in Mexico. We had to learn how this film fits into kind of what was being made there. And, we made a decision. When I say we, the main producer on the film, Kellen Quinn, made a decision with me early on that kind of every dollar we spent would be spent in Mexico. And that meant early on bringing on a team of Mexican producers that were, in a large part, our cultural guides, and helped us make sure that this film was working for Mexico and also working for the rest of the world. So I think it was an incredible learning experience in how to kind of tell stories that at the starting point maybe aren't yours to tell, and figuring out how to collaborate with the Ochoa family, with the Mexican filmmaking community, to get to a place that feels more natural and less extractive, I guess. And we didn't do a perfect job. There were moments where that kind of dynamic got really tricky, but we weren't in a rush, and we really gave the film the time that it needed to kind of figure itself out.
Yeah, I mean, just to hear that you spent 2 to 3 years sort of in the process, kind of learning to navigate. I'm sure it was also a time of strategizing what was the best format for production, right? What was the best way to roll and to keep rolling.
Yeah.
I'm interested in that part of the film, sort of the pragmatics of the process, right? Like, how much were you sleeping? Were you the only one with the camera? What was your eating schedule? How did you coordinate with their chaotic routine?
It was less about coordinating and more about just being very much a part of it. And what that kind of means is, starting my day when they start their day, and ending when they end. So we would start filming at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and often film all the way until 8, 9 in the morning. And they are doing that 7 days a week. And in terms of kind of food, I would eat what they would eat, and that would, largely be street tacos, and it's just really a process of becoming part of their family and living the ways that they live. My apartment was just a few blocks from their apartment, and we would just link up in the morning, and that was that. I shot the film as a one-person crew, which was really important for so many reasons: ethical reasons, just logistical reasons of how much space there was in the ambulance. Right. And there was a lot of kind of figuring out that needed to be done. I'm, with a lot of my films, I try to pick stories that are repetitive. The Ochoa's family is really repetitive in that every day they're doing the same routine, and that gave me kind of endless space to make mistakes, and to figure things out, and then to ultimately make really kind of firm decisions that aren't reactive, but are kind of already knowledgeable about what is going to happen. A lot of documentaries are forced to kind of throw themselves into situations where they don't know what's going to happen and they're kind of chasing the story. With
Right.
Midnight Family, I was, in the best scenes in the film, I was many steps ahead. I knew exactly how each scene shot by shot was going to unfold. Within a certain framework, anything could happen and I'd be prepared.
Yeah, that makes me wonder, like, how during the production, how you were anticipating piecing this together, the post-production. Were you already thinking that far ahead, or were you kind of open to whatever structure this took on in the post-production?
I was editing and filming simultaneously for that kind of 3-year period. We brought on a Mexican editor who was kind of the first one to start cutting the film, and she worked for kind of 4 or 5 months in the early days, and that was a really important process of kind of having someone who hadn't spent time in the ambulance take the footage and kind of show me where my blind spots were, show me how the footage was working for someone who was, grew up in Mexico City, and just show everything to me in a really new way. And that film that we cut together didn't end up being finished. We actually submitted it to Sundance at the end of 2017 and got rejected, and ultimately decided to kind of keep shooting and keep working forward. And that was a period where I kind of took the edit back into my own hands and felt that with what Paloma had taught me and the Mexican editor and what I just learned about the story after working on it so much, that I was kind of finally at a stage where I could do it. And so, like I said, we went back for that one last shoot. That was a 2 to 3 week period, and I shot 80% of what you see in the film. Kind of all of that knowledge, both on the production side and also the post-production side, kind of meshed together and gave me this really magical period where so much of the story came together.
Yeah. As I was watching the film, that was something that I was really curious about, is that editing process, because I'm sure you ended up with so much material, right? And it comes to the point where, okay, what makes it into the cut and what do you have to take out? Is there any material that you wish would have stayed on that unfortunately had to get edited out?
Yeah, so much. I mean, it's when editing, it's not, you can often get stuck in these moments where you have a really, really amazing scene that doesn't contribute to this kind of linear journey that you're trying to create for viewers. So what you're looking for is scenes that build on each other in a really specific way. With Midnight Family, I knew that the film needed to be 5 or 6 accidents, and each accident heightened the kind of ethical stakes in play. And so I would sometimes get a really amazing scene that just like didn't dovetail with that journey, and cuts of the film would try to kind of squeeze those in, and there would be this kind of jolting distraction, despite that maybe being one of the best scenes that I shot. So there's this process of really staying focused and not getting distracted from moments that are compelling, but not ultimately contributing in a direct way to kind of the thesis of the film. That often happens with humor. A joke is something you can, really feel yourself wanting to get into the film. Let's just squeeze it in before or after this scene. It's going to get a laugh. But that laugh can often be just a total distraction to what the audience was experiencing before and after. So a lot of moments with kind of Josué, the 9-year-old boy, where they're just like absolutely hilarious or really great character moments, they weren't contributing to what this kind of single idea that the film needed to be. I whenever I'm cutting, I try to put a note card just on my computer that distills the film into kind of just a few words. And that sort of focus, I feel like, is really needed for a film that already has so many kind of open-ended elements to it. And so, yeah, there's so much footage. I mean, maybe like 400 hours, maybe over 1,000 accidents.
Yeah, I can imagine. After so many years, how's your Chilango Spanish? How's your Mexico City Spanish?
It's good. I think they're the Ochoas, even to this day, get a huge kick out of teaching me really vulgar words.
You know, that's something that really makes the film feel even more raw and true to itself, right? Is that you're able to capture like the way that they have developed their own relationships, right? And that language in and of itself is really interesting as well. I guess one of the natural questions you get asked all the time might be, have you followed up with them? What is your communication with them like, or that relationship like?
Yeah, no, definitely. We're quite close. I try to kind of check in with them at least once a week, if not more. When we were, you know, the things with the film have largely kind of slowed down. It's now available, and so, but a few months ago we'd be talking every day almost. And they're good. You know, it's a really hard life that they have. It's very unpredictable. They have weeks where they're making it by quite well, and then weeks where they're really not. And it's you know, it's the life that they have. You know, the film did end up helping them out a bit. We gave them a percentage of the box office that the film was making, and we had a really large release in Mexico that sadly kind of got chopped by COVID. We were kind of in the second week of like 100 screen release, which was going to be by far kind of the biggest way that the film was getting out into the world, and that got kind of chopped. And the hope is that it can continue once theaters reopen. But yeah, cool. They're kind of hanging in. The city right now is actually really, I just talked to them yesterday, and it's quite slow. Just the amount of kind of accidents that are happening is way less, and that's really what they make a living on. I kind of asked about how much work they're doing with COVID patients, and that seemed to be kind of like a smaller part of what they're doing now.
Yeah, ironically, you kind of want there to be more work for them, but this is kind of like, for them to have work is to ask for accidents, right? Yeah, it's really interesting just to think about the time that you spent with them and that follow-up. And yeah, I'm sure you guys have a pretty nice communication going back and forth. What did you learn, or how did this production impact you sort of in a larger scope, thinking about, you know, our healthcare systems and the urgencies on both sides of the border?
It's a really good question. I think when I was kind of making the film, I was thinking about it in kind of two ways. I wanted it to work as a film. I wanted it to be a compelling story about a family trying to survive, and I wanted it to work just on a kind of a narrative and cinematic level. And then I also, you know, below that surface is a really important social issue, and one that kind of gives the film its substance and is hopefully leaving you with these really big thoughts, you know, as the film kind of ends, about how does money and profit affect the well-being of people. And that's a question that countries all over the world are grappling with. The systems in Mexico and the US are quite different in a lot of ways. I mean, Mexico has less than 6% of its population has private health insurance, and about 75% of the healthcare infrastructure is private. And so what you see in the Ochoa's ambulance is people who are uninsured kind of paying in cash to save their life. And the kind of ethics and emotions that came out in those moments were really kind of haunting. And you see a family like the Ochoa family that's put in this really impossible place. The burden of the system is put on their shoulders, and their ability to always do the right thing is kind of stripped from them. they can't just drive around offering free services to everybody. At the end of the day, it's a business, and it exists because there's that need. But then you see patients who kind of enter into their care without a knowledge of how the system should work, and end up not receiving the care that they kind of wanted or that they maybe deserved. So the story for me from the beginning was this tension between the Ochoa family needing to survive, patients needing to survive, and those two kind of needs bumping into each other, with money kind of always in the way. You know, in an ideal system, and what you have in a lot of good healthcare systems around the world, is that care is covered by the government and you know, free to the citizens. In the US, you know, an ambulance in New York City will cost you $1,500, $2,000. You'll get that bill and you'll have to figure out how to pay for it. So in some ways, the US system is not, and from a financial perspective, is maybe even more convoluted and confusing. I think the corruption is happening less on kind of a street level with people like the Ochoas, and more on kind of a corporate level. But you know, the film for me is not trying to be kind of overtly political in terms of its message, more so than just giving you a visceral, on the ground experience of what the kind of overlapping of money and healthcare looks like. And I think the perspective of the Ochoa family is a very kind of real space where those questions come up.
Yeah, I'm sure this triggered a lot of conversations internally in Mexico about how sort of broken this is, and the disparities, right? The social and economic disparities for people to have access to medical help. And I'm sure the Ochoas aren't the only family in this business, right? We're talking about hundreds, possibly, that are helping just within the city of Mexico. After releasing the film, were you able to pick up on any of those thoughts? Are people sort of being more empathetic and showing solidarity in terms of how do we even help or support these people, right?
I think so. And that was one of the really big kind of hopes, but also fears with making the film, is kind of, how do you explore a broken healthcare system on the backs of a really kind of vulnerable family? So how do I kind of show people how, you know, problematic this system is through the lens of a family that is barely making it by? And that was a really hard thing to kind of figure out. It ultimately came to the edit of the film really wanting to leave people with this feeling of them doing their absolute best despite being stuck in this corrupt system. And I think that feeling really stuck with people. Of when you take a good family, put them into this sort of situation, the choices they need to make are kind of, you know, extremely limited and difficult. And people have taken that from the film. The reputation of private ambulances in Mexico could not have been worse, and in a lot of ways couldn't be worse. They're seen as kind of leeches showing up to take advantage of sick people. And I think showing the Ochoa's experience of that is kind of opened people's eyes in a significant way. I think ambulances are not something you think about. If you need one kind of once in your life, that's a lot. And so it's not a story that was really reaching a public audience.
I'm going to invite people to post their questions. I'm sure Luke would be really interested in hearing from the viewers while we wait on some questions to pop up. I do have a few other things that I wanted to chat about. One of the other things people might be really excited to hear about is, what was their reaction when they first saw themselves on a large screen? Were you there? I'm sure looking inward for any of us does many things, right? To be able to sort of see yourself from a different lens, literally, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always the most nerve-wracking kind of moment as a filmmaker. You know, I spent 3 years on this and intentionally didn't show them any footage until until before we locked the edit. So
they
the film was
any of the editing process at all.
It was really important to me that they weren't thinking about the way that they were appearing on camera. And I knew that the ways in which an early cut could kind of trigger a certain sense of awareness could really keep the camera from becoming invisible. So I didn't show them anything, but I waited until the film was, I was about to lock edit, but it wasn't locked. So if there were any kind of huge surprises, there was still time to address them. And I showed it to them, and they, were really quick to really embrace the story that was being told and didn't ask for any changes. And I think a lot of that came from really long conversations that we had over the course of making the film, that, when something happened that felt like it would be a really difficult scene to include, I would pull them aside and kind of be like, hey, these are the sorts of moments that need to be in this film. How do you feel about that? And, the answers that I got really changed and opened over the course of making the film.
Yeah. We have a couple questions from people online. The first one is asking, even though you mentioned earlier how you didn't really see this production as a political statement, right? Or to tackle sort of the politics. This person is wondering if in any way the US-Mexico political tension sort of affected the creation of this film, and how was it received on both sides of the border?
It's a good question, and something that I thought a lot about as I was kind of making the film. I kind of started it before the Trump administration, and the kind of dialogues around our relationship with Mexico have obviously changed and over the past several years. And I found that politics can often be separated from what is otherwise just a more human connection. And my ability to connect with and get to know the Ochoa family happened in a space that felt very distant from the political dialogues that were happening. That being said, the way that the film is received happens very close to those dialogues. And it was really important to me to think about how their story kind of plays into people's preconceived notions about what Mexico is like. And I think the film has been both unsuccessful and successful in that way. Some people, leave the film thinking that Mexico is just, a mess of a healthcare system. And I think that's the sort of audience that I wish would kind of think more about the Ochoa family and about the kind of reality that's there. And then there are some people that leave with I think a really large amount of empathy for how hard life can be for a family like the Ochoa family. So, if you kind of just go and look at comments on different articles about it you get a whole spectrum of stuff. And I think the hope was to kind of begin those dialogues and get people engaging with a family that they otherwise, would know nothing about.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, one of the things as I was viewing the film is that I was hoping that it would make people empathize, but also sort of break down how complex Mexico is in its own chaotic way, right? And the why is also really important. We have a few more questions from viewers. Prem Anjali is asking, do you have a particular creative process? How does that unfold if you do, or even if you don't? Thanks.
Yeah, and there was a question above that from the same person about just what kind of inspires me. Yeah.
What's important to you? What inspires you? What moves you creatively as you consider your next projects?
I think the answer to that one is people. I'm always looking for, stories of people trying to, in spaces or worlds that feel overlooked, and also raise kind of really big questions about who we are as humans trying to kind of get by. That can be kind of in any realm. I've told sports stories, healthcare stories. I filmed with fishermen. I've filmed with iceberg specialists. It's all under this umbrella of, you know, hardworking people that seem driven and ambitious to kind of complete a goal. I think ambition is kind of one of the most cinematic sort of feelings of it's really engaging to watch people who are driven, and that can be in any space. I'm also really, you know, excited about cinema as, you know, and I think the history of documentary film is a short one, and also one that's still figuring out how to kind of harness and engage everything that, you know, cinema has to offer. I think fiction films have been much quicker to kind of figure that one out, and the way that technology and just kind of appreciation for documentaries is changing is kind of creating this whole open space to make documentaries that feel, you know, like these edge of your seat cinematic events. In terms of my process, I don't really have one. Each project is so unusual and so different, and that's what's so exciting about nonfiction film, is that it's real life, and you can't kind of take the same mold and just apply it to each story. I have things that I rely on to kind of keep me going, but I find that each project feels very new and very different.
Right. Let's, Charles also has another question. Were you always using a handheld camera, or did you sometimes use something like a dash cam?
So I shot with two cameras simultaneously, two Sony FS7s with the same 24mm prime lens. One was mounted firmly on the dashboard, filming the two people that were driving, and then the second camera was with me in the back. And that was often on a tripod and then sometimes handheld. So it was kind of a mix, and I needed both of those angles to kind of cross cover all of the action that was happening.
Was this a consistent sort of approach for the 2 to 3 years that you were rolling?
It kind of evolved. I started filming with just one camera, and then kind of as I got to know the space of the ambulance, kind of changed my approach and got it to be kind of better and better.
Yeah. Zach has a pretty interesting question. How did you approach the patients, families of patients who use the services of the Ochoas with regards to using footage of them in crisis? I assume you had to film first and then ask permission second?
It's a really good question. And it was something that, again, took a long time to figure out how to pull off in a way that felt ethical. The last accident in the film, for those of you that have seen it, is, or for those of you who haven't seen it, is a journey from an accident to the hospital with a mother who's sitting in the front of the ambulance, and you kind of see her facial expressions, and it's a really serious accident. And it's something that I filmed in the first week that I was with the Ochoa family, and I was totally unprepared and a bit kind of fish out of water with what I was trying to do. The idea at the time was to just have one camera mounted on the hood that would only film the Ochoa family, and I wasn't filming in the back of the ambulance. And over the course of filming for 3 years, that's the only moment that a family member who wasn't one of the Ochoas got in the front of the ambulance, but it happened. And I kind of felt really guilty about how that scene was shot, and I almost deleted the footage. Wow. But I kind of kept myself from doing that, and thought about it more, and eventually showed it to one of my old professors from college, and he really encouraged me to go and find that mother. And I had her address from the radio emergency call, and I just went and I knocked on her door about 6 months after the accident, and she let me in, and we ended up talking for a couple of hours. And her daughter Sonia had been studying journalism, and so she gave me permission to use the scene, and we're still in touch. That moment kind of taught me that there were people out there who, despite going through these really difficult moments, were willing to kind of share and willing to have those moments part of the film. And there was a much higher percentage than I ever would have expected. We eventually came up with a system where people would be asked, you know, before they would get brought into the ambulance, often the Ochoa family would ask a relative or the patient directly as they kind of entered their house or you know, began dealing with the patient. That wasn't always possible, and I would say about half of the time I would just have to stop filming or turn the camera off because somebody didn't want to be filmed, or I didn't feel like consent was something that was kind of possible in the moment. And then after each accident, I would kind of take the time or try to connect with those families and explain to them, you know, how the footage was going to be used and get a release form from them. And then on top of all of that, still making the decision to not, you know, include the faces or identities of the patients. You see family members occasionally, but not wanting to make a film that feels kind of too interested in the kind of trauma of the patients and focusing more on kind of the Ochoa family and the decisions that they're kind of making.
Yeah, it seems like there was definitely that process to develop on how to approach that, the sensibilities and being considerate of people. Last question coming from one of our viewers is really curious about how you decided to end your documentary. The question is, can you speak more of your decision to end the film in this way and what you were going to for artistically and story-wise?
Yeah, thanks. I really loved that moment. And for me, it's this moment of the family, you know, after what you see is kind of a series of really difficult nights. It's a moment of the family kind of coming together and wanting to be better and wanting to be a normal family. And that starts with kind of getting Josué back in school and getting him to go. And so the scenes around Josué throughout the film are kind of about that too, of them, you know, wanting their next generation to be better, wanting the next generation to be kind of smarter. And at the end of the film, you kind of see that play out. Josué goes to school sometimes and doesn't other times. So, you know, that was a lucky kind of moment in that when we were ending the filming, he was going, and he's kind of since come and gone, which is unfortunate. He's very quickly, you know, working in the ambulance more than he is going to school.
I'm sure you've been in touch with Josué. What is he in middle school by now?
He yeah, he's in middle school. He's I think about 13 now. And he was 9 when we first met. So he's growing up a lot. He's really tall. Yeah, he used to be like up to my hip, and now he's up to my shoulder.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see him grow up and hopefully break away and pursue something else other than in this business. No. Any last words for viewers, for people who have seen or haven't seen your film, to wrap this up, Luke?
No, just thanks so much for taking the time to join the conversation, spread the word. Kind of the only way that films like this really get out is word of mouth. So if you haven't seen it, see it, and if you have, spread the word. And thanks, Federico, for the time, and really appreciate it.
Of course, yeah. On behalf of Virginia Film Festival, we thank you again, Luke. Thank you for your time, for making such an extraordinary film. I encourage everyone on here, if you haven't seen the film, watch it. This is a good film to be thinking about how complex Mexico City is and Mexico at large is as well. So thank you again, Luke. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Tuning in.